Please welcome up to the stage our second speaker, Katie McKenzie, the Group Manager for the Australian Energy Market Operator.
Good evening, sustainability professionals, enthusiasts, and those that are a little bit curious. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you this evening on Wajak Noongar Budja, and I'd like to also pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My role these days is managing some pretty technical things, but my background is in energy law and policy. I sort of consider myself a bit of an energy nerd for short. It kind of encompasses a lot more. I feel like the people in the room this evening, are kindred spirits, very values driven. So a little of this will be preaching to the converted. If we want to maintain a planet that is livable, one with a climate that we can thrive in, or at the very least withstand, then we need to decarbonise. We don't have a planet B, and we don't have the luxury of a lot of time. Net zero emissions by 2050. 2050 seems like a really long way away, but in the energy sector, where things take a long time, it's actually not that far at all. So SDG 13, we need to take urgent action to address climate change and its impacts. Now, when we look at the options for decarbonising, we look at those industries that are particular emitters. One of the big ways in which we will achieve decarbonisation is by weaning ourselves off fossil fuels. So for the big industry, in order to decarbonise, a large part of that will be moving from using gas and coal onto electricity that's powered by renewables. And we also need to decarbonise our power system, replacing our old coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants over time with renewables as well. It needs to be affordable. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be sustainable. SDG 7. And in order to enable this, it's going to take some really smart people. It's going to take a lot of collaboration across industries. It's going to take a lot of investment in infrastructure. But we're up to the challenge. SDG 9. I must admit, I was suffering a little bit from choice paralysis leading up to today in which way to take this talk. There's so much when it comes to this topic, and what I love about energy is that it is so complex, that there is not a single discipline or profession that is going to solve these problems. We absolutely have to collaborate, but it underpins our economy, and it's so important to us at that household level as well. And when you see how our lives have evolved and our expectations, the things that we depend on, have changed over time, we've become so much more reliant on all things that are digital, comfortable. They rely on electricity. I was thinking back to the 90s when I was on school holidays in Geraldton. It was Boxing Day, it was 48 degrees, and we were camping in my aunt's backyard. And 48 degrees, like so hot. We didn't have any air conditioning back then, and so we all piled into the car and went to the hospital where we could take refuge from the heat because it was nice and cold in there. A month before that, Johnny Howard and his government of the time came out with their response to the Kyoto Protocol, and how Australia was going to tackle climate change. Now, when we looked at that safeguarding Australia's future, a major part of that was to promote renewable energy. Now, we already had some renewables in WA. I think our first wind farm went in the 80s. I was around then. I won't tell you how old though, when it went in. But, you know, their visionary idea was to increase renewables by 2%. So we rolled into the 2000s with a target of 2%, and we saw various investments happening across WA around renewable energy, predominantly wind. Come 2007, Kevin 07, for those of you that have been around a while here, Kevin and his government said, we are going to up the ante. We are going to increase this goal tenfold. We are going to make it 20% by 2020. Beautiful. And so in the meantime, you know, I've graduated from high school, I've done my law degree, and I'm now a baby lawyer working in the energy team at a commercial law firm. And my boss at the time had done a lot of the reforms in the energy space and sort of felt that he had a duty to play in trying to herd some of the cats. So we were partnering with the Chamber of Minerals and Energy at that time to get people together to think, how on earth are we going to achieve 20% renewables by 2020? And we had a big round table and everyone talked about all the reasons why it wasn't possible, particularly for WA, because WA is different. We're not connected up with any other states. We've just got these long transmission system. Roughly half of our poles and wires go to serving only 3% of our customers, which is just astronomical. That equals expensive because the head count you're smearing the costs across is very small. So even though we didn't think it was possible, some pretty extraordinary things happened in the following decade with some policy around rooftop solar, introducing some feed-in tariffs. We saw rooftop solar go absolutely gangbusters, way beyond what anybody could have expected. And each year, my now employer, the Australian Energy Market Operator, who's responsible for managing both the market and the electricity system, every year they got their forecasts wrong because every year rooftop solar absolutely outdid anything we were expecting. It was incredible. At the same time, things had really kind of stalled in WA with new renewables. We'd sort of done all that we kind of could without expanding the network. But towards the end of the decade, we had to think outside of the box. At the time, I was working for the State Treasurer and Energy Minister, and we thought, well, how are we going to enable more renewables during this time? We know that it is costly to build out the network, so how can we get more in? So there were some policy changes that happened at that time to think outside of the box around how we could do things a little bit differently in WA. At that same time, we worked very closely with the communities that had all of Western Australia's coal-fired power plants in it, the community of Collie in the southwest of WA, to sort of talk to them around what a just transition might look like, and went about looking at how can we go and retire these coal-fired power stations and start to really action on weaning ourselves off these fossil fuels. So we're now sort of fast-forwarding to today, And despite the fact that 2% looked hard, 20% didn't look possible, there have been moments in our system where we have had 84% of demand met by renewables. It's just incredible. And I'm going to tell you shortly why that's so incredible. If we want to decarbonise and we want to save the planet, we need to do better. And so that's what we're working on at AEMO, along with the rest of industry, is how are we going to go that extra mile? How are we going to close the gap on the extra 16%? Because even though we've made it to 84%, there is actually at times enough to meet 100% of what we need. But for other reasons, we haven't been able to do it. I'm going to pause a moment and come back to my point about industry and their decarbonisation pathways actually being linked to moving to the use of electricity. What this means is that we are going to see demand for electricity absolutely skyrocket if we are going to be able to decarbonise them within the next 2 decades. At the same time, we are going to be retiring our trusty old coal-fired power stations. So I sort of think of this as a little bit of a crocodile. I'm responsible, or my team's responsible for the long-term forecasting of supply and demand. So this is what demand's doing, and this is what supply is doing. Okay, so, that's the problem. That's the problem in and of itself. We need to build so many more renewables. Now, one of the tricky things about renewables, there's so many great things about it, and we absolutely need to do it. So that's not in question. But there are some tricky things. Show of hands, who's been to an AFL football game before? Yeah, I thought that was a safe assumption. I under duress, have gotten into AFL over the last couple of years with my partner. So for a solar farm, to produce, if it was kind of going gangbusters, amazing day, incredible access to the sun, to get a gigawatt of electricity to power one of these big industrial players, we're looking at 1,300 AFL fields. 1,300. And the equivalent in wind is 300. And in battery storage, it's 55. But that's only going to meet your needs for about 4 hours because batteries don't generate, they just store it and release it until later in the day when you need it. So the fact that it requires so much space, it means that you can't just put it in the backyard or on your rooftop to meet industrial demand. You're going to need to build it further away where you've got the luxury of space and you've done the right things with your environmental approvals and you've engaged in a meaningful way and secured true informed consent from the Indigenous people of that area. There you can put your renewables. And so that is quite far from where we live and where our transmission system currently is. So it's going to mean that we have to build long transmission wires out to these places. And that takes time to plan. And it costs a lot as well. So space and transmission, that's one challenge. I asked Mike to give me a heads up on where we're at on time. And then I proceeded to completely ignore him for the last gosh knows how long. So is that 3 minutes? 2 minutes, wow, okay, I haven't even hit the main points yet. This is what happens when you go off script. So space is one thing. The other thing is, any sailors or windsurfers in the room? You don't have to be ashamed. It's okay. I wore my brooch today, a little storm in a teacup, but anyone that's spent time on the water knows that you're not going anywhere if the wind's not blowing. And so one of the issues we have as we move to renewables and we get up to that 100% renewables, we become so incredibly dependent on the weather. Suddenly, you have a day where, it's a little bit cloudy and you're thinking, oh my gosh, what's that going to mean for the system? You can end up with swings in the amount of renewables that are available to, the equivalent of powering over 1 million homes in a very, very short period of time. And what we're seeing as well, particularly in winter, where you have essentially shorter days. The sun is rising later in the day, it's setting earlier in the day, it's very cloudy, means your solar output is rubbish. But then also that can happen at the same time that the wind's just not blowing. And we've seen that be the case for multiple days. So suddenly your battery storage that you've invested in isn't going to be able to recharge itself to jump in. So at the moment, we find ourselves in a position where we're retiring all of the state-owned coal by 2030, but we're going to need gas for a while until we have something else to jump in, because batteries do not charge themselves. They need something else as well. So we need to really be working on those innovative solutions to fill the gaps. We also need to be looking at how we better forecast as well. I got married last year, and in the lead up to the wedding, my wife, my now wife, was looking at 5 different weather apps daily. And on the wedding day, hourly, right? Massive nerd. But each one was saying slightly different things. When we picked the date for the wedding, a year and a half in advance, we were absolutely taking a punt. We didn't know. So planning 10 years in advance, 20 years in advance, when you don't know what the weather's going to do, is really, really tricky. But it's even tricky on the day of, when you've got the benefit of all of these forecasts. It's still really, really tricky. So we need to be investing in the modelling tools, in the data that we can get around weather as well. But we also need to make sure that the generation that we have is flexible enough to work with the much more volatile system that we have. I don't know if you're standing there because I need to get off. I'm going to get off. Okay, finally, wrapping it all up, what does all of this mean for you? First of all, I would say, and I'm stealing from the recycling space where they talk about reduce, reuse, recycle. The lowest carbon electron is the one we don't generate. So thinking about your demand for energy, particularly when it is a hot day, a really cold day, everyone else has the same idea that they want to run their cooling or heating. So if you can start investing in solar passive design and having really great insulation and various other things, all those things that mean your life is more comfortable, but you're also not drawing on the system when everybody else is a really positive thing as well. As I said, I almost couldn't come today because of my choice paralysis around all of the topics I wanted to talk about. There's a whole other rabbit hole I could go down around, global security issues, the number of minerals you're using, the trade-offs that there are around biodiversity, system security issues. That will put you to sleep, but it is really interesting for energy nerds. So if you want to come and have a chat, please do. Thank you very much.